So we've got to set the stage, lay the table, talk about the field of play to begin with. That is the multi-trillion-dollar health and wellness industry. This is big, big business. In fact, the industry is so large that if you took the smartphone industry, the fast food industry, and all social media platforms combined, the combined profits from all of these places still wouldn't surpass the net profits from health and wellness. Unfortunately, misinformation is rife, as we've just been hearing. In fact, nowhere is misinformation more prevalent than in the health and wellness industry. Now, I could have picked many tens of thousands of examples to prove this to you, but this is the one that I went with for obvious reasons. This is a product that I found on Amazon recently, a couple of weeks ago. This is a liver cleansing nasal herbal box. And I think it's made in Russia for reasons that you'll see in just a moment. The manufacturer suggests that you take 10 sniffs of this herbal remedy every day, and it can regenerate the liver by a very precise 98.84%. Yeah, it's incredible. I'm not sure if any of these claims have been evaluated by the FDA, but anyway, or proven by any kind of studies. It can remove fat from the liver, detoxify the liver, help with digestive support. It can turn your liver from brown to red. Everybody knows that a red liver is a healthy liver. And this is the best part. If you don't buy the product, then this very angry Russian-looking man is going to smash this shot of vodka and then come and murder you. So, look, as ridiculous as these products seem, they sell. They wouldn't be online if people weren't buying them, and this is the problem. Why are they selling? Well, this is because the expert advice to eat healthily and to exercise and be physically active is difficult. Salads generally don't taste very good, unless you get a salad and you put bacon and chicken and dressing and croutons and blue cheese in it, by which point it's not really a salad anymore, is it? Let's be honest. And exercise is difficult and you get sweaty, and it takes a long time to get any results. We prefer the promise of quick fixes and rapid results, and in health and wellness, we are never far from the promise of a quick fix. We don't want to exercise every day for 6 months. We want to exercise for 10 minutes. We want to get tough in 10 minutes, and we want 9 minutes pain-free knees. We want to meditate for 8 minutes and 7-minute productivity. We want 6-minute fitness. We want to relieve stress in 5 minutes. We want 4-minute abs. No, we don't. We want 3-minute abs. We want to do yoga for 2 minutes and, of course, the 1-minute workout. Yeah, thank you. Hat tip to Timothy, wherever he is. You thought I was finished, but we've got the 30-second workout. I'm still not done. The 5-second fitness. All of these are books, and some of them are bestsellers. Why do we fall for these ridiculous claims? Why? Well, we've heard a little bit. We heard from Melanie earlier on, and Rena spoke about some of these things as well. The big problem is that when the human and pre-human genome was being naturally selected, when we were hunter-gatherers, hunting and gathering for our resources, being economic with our time and our energy served a really important survival advantage. We've literally evolved to follow a path of least resistance, at least when it comes to managing our energy and our resources. And our genes haven't really changed very much in the last 50,000 years or so. But society has changed a lot. You could argue that society has changed more in the last 50 years than in the last 500. We haven't evolved the critical thinking skills to navigate social media, fake news, and misinformation, disinformation. We are literally using analog critical thinking skills to navigate a digital age. We yearn for simple solutions to complex problems. This is how the God of the Gaps argument evolved. We'd rather believe anything at all, even make up our answers, than sit with a little bit of uncertainty. And digital media knows this, and they've spun this obsession into clickbait headlines. So let me give you an example. On the left-hand side is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a review of all the studies that have been done in a particular area, and then they overlay some kind of statistical analyses to look at bias and overall trends. And this meta-analysis has looked at 26 studies on the best time of day to exercise. And what they've concluded is it doesn't really matter. Whatever outcomes you're exercising for, whether it's weight loss or endurance or improving strength or to get in shape, it doesn't matter when you exercise. You can exercise in the morning, afternoon, or evening, or you can do like I did when I was an undergraduate student and exercise at 2 a.m. when my housemates went to bed, because I'm a party animal, apparently. And it doesn't really matter as long as you are consistent. Now, this particular study got an altmetric score of 524. Now, what that means, the altmetric score is basically a way of quantifying the attention that a particular paper gets in terms of its news coverage and how much it's talked about on social media. 524 is pretty respectable. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen is a one-off, single, independent study that went completely against the scientific consensus. What they found was that if you're a woman, it's better to exercise in the morning if you want to lose weight, and if you're a man and you want to reduce your blood pressure, you should exercise in the afternoon. By all accounts, it was a crappy study, small sample sizes, small effects, and you can see that the altmetric score was something like 3 times higher than the other one. And that is because the headline, "The best time of day to exercise is," will always get more clicks, will always get more attention than "it doesn't matter when you exercise." Case in point, New York Times, Time Magazine, BBC News, and a bunch of other outlets all jumped on this study and reported it widely. So the current system allows digital media to control the health and wellness narrative, especially when it comes to science. As scientists, as a researcher, we work very hard to produce data. And we try and make sure the data are robust and it's valid, and we accumulate all this knowledge, and then it goes into the digital media meat grinder, and out at the other end comes myth and misinformation and pseudoscience. The digital media machine is taking the science meat and turning it into a clickbait sausage. Yes, that's a horrible analogy. So if you're looking for a faceless entity to blame for all of our misinformation troubles, you can blame lots of different entities, but you can blame the media. But can you? Can you blame the media exclusively, or is there another entity at fault here? This is Eric Perlman. He's an American physiologist specializing in research on obesity, menopause, and aging. And in 2006, he was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison in one of the largest cases of scientific misconduct on record, for falsifying data on 10 papers and 17 grant applications worth more than $3 million. Just before he was sentenced, he sent a letter to the judge pleading for leniency, in which he said, "I was motivated by my own desire to advance as a respected scientist." Now that's overt misconduct, but something more subtle and deep-rooted in our institutional norms is something called questionable research practice, or QRP. And QRPs potentially do more long-term harm to scientific inquiry. Now, the problem is here is that researchers are under a lot of pressure. I can say this from experience. We're under pressure to improve our publication record, under pressure to bring in grants, under pressure to teach classes, grade papers, to make tenure. And sometimes this can incentivize researchers to introduce errors into their study design, the analysis, or their reporting, either deliberately or inadvertently. So what I want to do now is look at some examples where QRPs have actually manifested in peer-reviewed published literature. And just a word of warning for those of you who are of a nervous or squeamish disposition, the following slides contain examples of rampant pseudoscience. So you have been warned. Okay, let's start by talking about vitamin D, something that is vitamin D. I was told off about this yesterday. Can't promise I'm not going to make that mistake again. Vitamin D, and this is something that's very trendy, especially since COVID. This is a study that was published a few years ago. You can see the title of the study on the left, Association of Vitamin D Supplementation on Cardiorespiratory Fitness. And I first learned about this study when it was tweeted by Rhonda Patrick, and she is a PhD in biomedical science. She's a well-known podcaster. She has over 500,000 followers on Twitter. Yes, it will always be Twitter. I refuse to call it X. And within a few hours, this tweet, you can see, had been retweeted more than 500 times and had over 2,500 likes. Now, very, very briefly in this study, the researchers got 40 pairs of identical twins. And they split the twins down the middle, and one of the twins went into a control group who did absolutely nothing for 60 days. That's my kind of study. And then the other twin went into an intervention group who were given high-dose vitamin D for 60 days. There was no other intervention. That was the study. So what did they find? Well, 10 seconds after looking at their table 2, I knew something was wrong. So this table shows the pre- and post-intervention results on cardiorespiratory fitness. Don't worry about anything else in the table other than that top row. I've highlighted it. You can see the metric there is something called VO2 max. V is volume, O2 is oxygen, max is the maximum volume of oxygen that can be taken in and used in 1 minute of maximal exercise. So this is a surrogate for maximal cardiorespiratory fitness. It is a gold standard. And typically, what we see in the literature is if you have a higher VO2 max, you tend to have a lower risk of cardiometabolic disease and early mortality and so forth. So having a high VO2 max is a good thing. You can see that at time point 0 and time point 60 in the control group, there was no change in VO2 max. Okay, 2.2, 2.1, that's within the error rate. In the supplemented group, you can see that vitamin D supplementation for 60 days improved cardiorespiratory fitness from 2.0 to 2.6 liters per minute, and that is an increase of 27%. Now that is sensational. That is extraordinary. That is bullshit. And I'm going to show you why. So this disturbed me, right? Because I did some digging into the literature, and I did a sort of mini literature review, and I found that if you got the same group of individuals who are relatively untrained, and you took them through an endurance training program for 8 weeks, so the same duration of the study, if you are lucky, you might improve cardiorespiratory fitness between 7 and 18%. If you took the same group and took them on an altitude training intervention, which is an intervention that athletes use to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness, you might improve fitness by 3 to 10%. And if you took an individual through a systematic and sophisticated blood doping program, then again, you might get an improvement of between 8 and 12%. Incidentally, this is the candid moment that cross-country skier Max Hawk was busted in an anti-doping raid in 2019. You can see the needle still in his arm, which I think is hilarious. He didn't think it was hilarious. So vitamin D, 30% increase. I'm highly skeptical. It doesn't seem scientifically plausible. There's another big problem with this study. We go back to table 2. Now you can see there was an increase in absolute VO2 max, liters per minute, absolute terms. The metric below that one on the second row is what we call relative VO2 max. It's the exact same value, but instead of being expressed in liters, it's expressed in milliliters, and it's divided by body mass. Okay, so one of the values is in absolute terms, the other one is relative to body weight. You can see in the supplemented group that you get an increase in absolute values, but no increase in relative values. These two values are mathematically linked. The only way that we can see an increase in one value and not an increase in the other is if the individuals have put on weight. How much weight would they have to have put on in 60 days for these numbers to make sense? About 50 pounds. 50 pounds in 2 months just using vitamin D. This is nonsense. So there was a formal investigation. The researchers were asked to hand over their data. They either wouldn't or couldn't. And the paper was eventually retracted based off of the evidence that I'd accumulated. But not before it had accumulated an altmetric score of 321, and the abstract had been downloaded more than 6,500 times. So this is bad science. Okay, what's one example? Let's talk about oxygenated water, or hydrogenated water if you prefer. And this is a growing industry. It's becoming commercially actually very huge, believe it or not. This is just normal water, and they've bubbled oxygen under high pressure into the thing to increase its oxygen content, and they make all sorts of claims to health and exercise performance. Now, in this study, which was published in 2022, they used an oxygen nanobubble beverage. And it must be legitimate because it's got the word nano in it. The follow-up is going to be called quantum bubbles, maybe, I don't know. Quantum nano. And very simple study, they got 10 cyclists, so 10 trained individuals, and they got them to exercise for about 60 minutes. It was a maximal kind of time trial on 2 occasions. On one occasion, they were given plain water. On another occasion, they were given this oxygen nanobubble beverage, which supplied an extra 15 milliliters of oxygen, but it went through the gastrointestinal tract. It bypassed the lungs and the airways, and it went through the gut, which is a legitimate mechanism in some cases. What did they find? Well, as you'd expect, they found something quite incredible. On the left-hand side, you see the time to complete the time trial. With the O2 drink, the time was significantly lower, significantly quicker than it was with the placebo. This was an improvement of 2.5% with the O2 drink. On the right-hand side, you can see average power output during the exercise trial, and this was an improvement of 4%. So 4% more power with the O2 drink, and that was the equivalent of about 10 watts. Remember that, 10 watts. The researchers concluded that our results suggest that the oxygen nanobubble beverage may provide a practical and effective ergogenic aid for competitive cyclists. Ergogenic in this context just means performance enhancing. So let's pit these two entities against each other. On the left-hand side, we've got the human respiratory system. And it's been evolving for something like 500 million years, give or take, a few million. And the airways, all of the millions of branches of the upper and lower airways, if you put them back to back, they would reach about 1,500 miles, which is approximately the distance from New York to Miami, Florida. The surface area of the lungs is about the size of a tennis court because that maximizes gas exchange efficiency. And during moderate to high intensity exercise, the human respiratory system can shift about 150,000 milliliters of oxygen. This is an incredible piece of machinery. By contrast, the O2 supplement has been around for about 2 years. It doesn't have any airways, the surface area is pretty small, and the amount of O2 that it supplies is really negligible compared to the human respiratory system. So how much power would this tiny amount of oxygen actually provide? Well, again, we can do the math. We know that cellular respiration of 1 liter of oxygen will yield about 5 calories of energy. Okay, give or take. It's between 4.9 and 5.1, but we can just say 5 calories of energy. So 15 milliliters of oxygen will provide 0.075 calories, or we can express that in joules, 314, okay? Simple. Using this very simple equation, if we want to know the power, we have the energy, because we've just calculated it, 314 joules, divided by time, which was the average amount of time that it took the cyclist to finish the time trial. That would equate on average to about 0.095 extra watts of power during the entire trial, not 10 watts as reported by the authors. So given that this is fairly rudimentary physiology, I had to ask myself, what do we think the motivations are of the authors? Because this is pretty plain to see. So what is inspiring them here? So I donned my best deerstalker and lit my licorice pipe, and I decided to do some digging. And I found that one of the main authors of the study, Professor Eleanor Stride, who is a respected scientist, or at least was a respected scientist in her own right, she appears on the manufacturer's website actually personally endorsing the product and offering a testimonial on how great it is. I went back even further and found this patent from 2017, and whose name happens to be on the patent? Yeah, you guessed it, Eleanor Stride. So she is one of the original inventors of the product. So when we ask what was the key motivation for doing this study, I think we know what the key motivation for doing the study was. So I basically concur with the most concise abstract I've ever seen in this BJSM editorial. Ergogenic claims for oxygenated water cannot be taken seriously. I wish all abstracts were this concise. Okay, one more example. Stay with me. Concussion is back in the media, and rightfully so, because there have been a string of high-profile concussions, particularly in football. Concussion causes a lot of damage. Normally, this is a concussion in contact sport is caused by impact to the head or to the body, causing the brain to shake or slosh around in its shell. And this is what causes the damage. In this study that was published just a few weeks ago, head shake and concussion, especially in football, are usually reported together and rarely independently. And just interestingly, the lead author on this study is a chap called Chris Nowinski. If there are any professional wrestling fans in here, you look like professional wrestling fans, all of you. He used to be a WWE wrestler. He had to retire from professional wrestling because he sustained a serious concussion. So he went off, got his PhD in neuroscience, and now he's contributing to the literature on concussion risk and concussion injury. And I think that's pretty cool. So this is a really major problem. It's reducing quality of life. It's destroying lives, and in some cases, taking lives. And the paradox is that when we have something that is this much of a problem and we need urgent solutions, this can be highly lucrative, and it means that it can sometimes incentivize bad science and sensationalism. Q, the Q collar. You see what I did? Q thing. And this is from Q30 Innovations, an R&D product development company from Westport, Connecticut. Anybody from Connecticut here? Yeah, one person. I knew you were here, that's why I said it. And the Q collar is just a C-shaped device. You can see it on the screen. It goes around the neck, and it just gently compresses the blood vessels in the neck. And in theory, it traps a little bit of blood around the brain, and it helps just create a little bit of protection, a little bit of kind of bubble wrap around the brain to, in theory, reduce the risk of concussion. It's the brain baby of a chap called Dr. David Smith, who's a former internal medicine practitioner, and he claims to have two sources of inspiration for the product. The first one is the humble woodpecker. Now, the life cycle of the woodpecker involves going around and drilling holes in trees and wooded panels on the sides of buildings using its face. And the idea being is that the woodpecker has this evolutionarily derived muscle in the neck that contracts just at the point of impact to trap blood in the brain. This is Dr. Smith describing the mechanism in his own words. There should be sound on that.
Head ramming sheep and the woodpecker, both of these animals have these muscles in their neck called an OMO, which stands for shoulder, hyoid muscle, and it actually compresses the vasculature of the neck and creates a change in how fast fluids are able to get back out of the brain space.
Now, Q30's Q collar brings this breakthrough technology to all sports venues.
I mean, the video goes on for another 10 minutes, and we don't have time to see the whole thing, but you kind of get the idea. So that was one source of inspiration. The other source of inspiration that Smith talks about is this study that he published in 2013, showing that there were fewer concussions in football games that were contested at altitude. So again, just look at the very top row. You can see on the left-hand side, this is low altitude that they described or defined as 644 feet or below. And you can see the total number of concussions there over a number of different seasons were 1,461. And on the right-hand side, the games that were contested above 645 feet had a fewer total number of concussions, only 1,306. They reasoned that the fluid distribution that occurs at altitude because of the change in partial pressure causes this same kind of similar mechanism as before, protecting the brain. The authors concluded that the increased physiological responses to altitude may be associated with a reduction in sports-related concussion. But the skepticism swelled like a rising tide, and a lot of people took issue with this study for a number of reasons. Number one, the altitude cutoff was just arbitrarily defined. There was no explanation in the paper for why they used 644 feet. For context, there is no physiological reason why going up and summiting the Seattle Space Needle or just close to the top of the Eiffel Tower would necessarily reduce your risk of concussion. The science just doesn't add up. The experts generally agree that physiologically meaningful effects would only occur at around 2,000 meters or 6,500 feet. So that's the first problem with the study. The other problem, and this is a little bit more of a profound problem, is that the seasons that they studied You can see here from the 2005-2006 season all the way through to 2011-2012 were cherry-picked to show the findings that the authors wanted. In a separate study, Smoliger and colleagues looked at the 4 consecutive seasons after the other study, and they found that there was a meaningful difference in concussion at altitude only in one of those seasons. So there is no consistent effect here. In fact, they showed that there is a robust correlation between concussion risk and whether the team had an animal logo on their shirt. In fact, animal logo was a stronger predictor of concussion risk than altitude. Teams with an animal logo had a 25% lower risk of players sustaining concussion. This is an obvious post hoc fallacy, post hoc ergo propter hoc, or the confusion of correlation and causation. They're obviously different things. The final nail in the Q-collar research, final nail in the coffin of the Q-collar research was this editorial where Smoliger paired up with Liz Wang, who's an ornithologist. They trawled through woodpecker literature. There's a lot of it apparently from the 1700s all the way to the present day. They found absolutely no evidence of a muscle in the bird's net that contracts at the point of impact to protect the brain from injury. But this was not before the Q-collar researchers published editorials in obviously the New York Times and even the British Journal of Sports Medicine. This is a marketing-focused or a marketing-first approach. The whole point is to secure funding, to secure partnerships, and to get media attention at the expense of scientific research and transparency. I've seen this before. It sounds familiar. I can't put my finger on where I've seen it before, but it's not that uncommon. So the media are certainly to blame for much of the misinformation that we see in health and wellness, but they're not exclusively to blame. They can only report on what they're given, and when the science is not particularly robust, we have a garbage in, garbage out kind of scenario. In the modern health and wellness industry, facts are expensive, fictions are cheap. So, how can we work together to untangle this mess and improve transparency and openness in science, especially in health and wellness where it's needed most? It's not all bad. There are a lot of scientists most scientists do really good work, really valid work, but just the minority of bad actors just undermine the whole discipline. I'm optimistic that with a few targeted interventions we can make a difference. Now, I'm inclined to defer to Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. I work with a lot of researchers, and I've got several PhD students. They work very hard, but sometimes they just lack this basic understanding of the mechanics of research methodology. I wouldn't say it's stupidity, it's just naivety, perhaps. So in 2023, last year, I paired up with Professor Paddy Ekikakis from Michigan State University. We published this paper, Overcoming the Ostrich Effect, for obvious reasons, because we found that people in our discipline like to bury their heads in the sand, pretend that there's no problem going on. That doesn't help anyone. And we discussed some of the most prominent questionable research practices that we found. I won't go into these in any particular detail because, well, it's quite boring, to be perfectly honest with you. But needless to say, things like understanding statistical power and sample size, not over-relying on p-values at the expense of everything else, is very important. We need to crack down on pay-to-publish journals. These are open access journals. They are often predatory, and they offer publication with little to no peer review. Now, this is a positive in some ways because it means that there's no paywall for the public to overcome, so it improves the availability of science. But it's a negative because the peer review is often very, very lax or rushed, and it allows more low-quality data to flood into circulation. And of course, journals are incentivized to publish as many papers as possible because they get more money. And so it's flooding the literature. You can see since 2010, there's been an exponential increase in open access only journals. There have been a number of calls in recent years for study pre-registration. So this is when the study is, well, pre-registered, well in advance of even collecting data, in advance of even recruiting subjects or patients, so that you can compare the initial plan with the final results. In objective blinded analyses, pre-registered studies outperformed non-pre-registered studies in pretty much every aspect, in the quality of the data, the results, the discussion, and the justified conclusions. Pre-registration is not mandatory except in medicine, but I think it should be mandatory across the board. And if it's not mandatory, we should definitely be incentivizing it. Like this study in psychological science, they used these badges, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. And it seems a little bit childish, but actually studies that conformed better to more open science practices like pre-registration were allowed to proudly display these kinds of badges on their papers. And when they introduced this initiative, shown here by the red line, you can see that there was this exponential increase in the number of studies that conformed to open science. And the control journals, you can see that there's no difference. So if it's not going to be mandatory, we can at least incentivize it. And last but not least is the question of whether we should be paying experts to do peer reviews. The elephant in the room here is that the examples I gave early on, vitamin D, concussion research, oxygenated water, these have all gone through peer review and they've been approved for publication and they've somehow slipped through the net. Academics are busy, I've said this before. They're grading papers, they're trying to get their own papers out, they're writing grants, they're doing teaching, and then we're asking them to do more work for free. As an associate editor of a journal in kinesiology, I sometimes have to email a dozen, 2 dozen experts in the field just to get one positive response. And even then, the reviews are often rushed and they lack the due care and attention. Publishers can definitely afford to pay their reviewers. These are the profit margins from some major companies. Amazon have a profit margin of about 2%, but it's obviously 2% of 174 billion, so they still make a lot of money. Google, 11%, BMW, 9%, Apple, 21%, and then the 2 academic publishers that you can see here, Elsevier and Taylor and Francis, have profit margins of 37 and 39%. They can definitely afford to pay their reviewers. The results would be that they would get more expert reviewers, reviewers would spend more time on the papers, and you'd get better quality reviews. If you pay peanuts, well, you know the rest. So in closing, it's tempting to think of science as a body of knowledge, this collection of facts and figures through which we understand the natural world. But it isn't. It's none of those things. Science is a process or a series of processes that we use to test our hypotheses and arrive at valid conclusions. But the validity of our conclusions hinges on the quality of our processes. So in order to regain public trust in science and scientific institutions, we've got to wrestle the emphasis away from quantity and back onto quality. It's got to be a substance over style approach. Or at least, ideally, we'd have a good helping of both. I'm going to finish with a quote from one man who had plenty of both style and substance. I always finish with a quote, and this time it's coming from the indomitable Carl Sagan. Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. I think scientists need to take that quote to heart. And we could do a lot worse than adopt this as a sort of mantra, as a sort of oath to be taken by scientists and the stewards of scientific research into the future. And as it turns out, woodpeckers do get head injuries after all. Who'd have thought?